Thomas Keene did not look like a killer. That was the first thing everyone said, the first thing that threw them off balance. He sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room with his hands folded neatly on the metal table, his posture ramrod straight, his expression unnervingly calm. His hair was just starting to gray at the temples, his beard trimmed with a precision that spoke of a meticulous nature. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and a soft, comfortable sweater that made him look more like a gentle college professor than a man accused of orchestrating a woman's death. Sheriff Morales watched him through the one-way glass, a familiar unease tightening her chest. She'd been a cop long enough to know that the most dangerous people rarely announce themselves with fangs and claws. They often come packaged in normalcy, their danger hidden behind a disarming smile or a quiet demeanor. Keene was a masterclass in this kind of deception. Detective Holloway entered the room alone. He always preferred it, that way less noise, fewer distractions, a straight line between him and his subject. Keene looked up as the door clicked shut, and a faint, knowing smile touched his lips. "Good morning," Keene said, his voice even and smooth. "I was wondering when you'd come." Holloway slid into the chair opposite him, the metal legs scraping against the floor. He didn't return the smile. "That doesn't surprise me," he replied, his voice a low growl. "You seem to be someone who anticipates things." Keene inclined his head slightly, a gesture that was both polite and condescending. "Awareness is the first step toward freedom." Holloway let the pseudo-philosophical remark hang in the air, unanswered. He wasn't here for a debate on enlightenment. He slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of Rachel Whitman, smiling, vibrant, alive. Her eyes seemed to sparkle with a life that had been brutally extinguished. Keene looked at the photo for a long, heavy moment. His expression softened, his eyes gaining a distant, almost sorrowful quality. "She was very lost," he said quietly, his voice filled with a strange sort of empathy. Holloway felt his jaw tighten. This was a game and Keene was setting the rules. "You knew her?" Holloway asked, keeping his tone flat and professional. "Yes," Keene replied, his gaze still fixed on Rachel's face. In the way one can know another soul. Holloway's patience was wearing thin. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "Let's try this again, shall we? No more riddles." "How did you know Rachel Whitman?" "Through second path," Keene said, the name rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "She reached out to us." Holloway had already done his homework. "She didn't," he countered. "She was invited." Keene's smile didn't falter for a second. "An invitation is just a formality, detective. A little nudge. People find us when they're ready." "Ready for what?" Holloway pressed, the question sharp and pointed. Keene leaned back in his chair, the picture of relaxation. He looked at Holloway as if he were a student in need of a lesson. "For transformation," he said. The interview went exactly where Holloway expected it to go. Nowhere. Keene was a fortress of denial and deflection. He admitted to being a part of this group, this second path, but denied creating it or leading it. He acknowledged exchanging messages with Rachel, but skillfully framed it as providing simple emotional support, like a friend lending an ear. He even admitted to meeting her near the park where her body was later found. He claimed they'd talked for nearly an hour, a deep and meaningful conversation. But he insisted he left her alive and calm, watching her walk toward the wooded trail. "She wanted to be alone," Keene said, his expression one of profound respect. "I honored that wish." Holloway decided to go for the jugular. "Did you give her ambing?" he asked, the word hanging heavy in the small room. For the first time, Keene looked genuinely surprised, almost offended. "Of course not. That's a crude tool. We don't operate that way." "Did you touch her?" Holloway pressed, his voice rising. "No." "Did you follow her into the woods?" "No." Holloway leaned in close, their faces inches apart. "Did you kill her?" Keene met his eyes without flinching, his gaze steady and unwavering. "No." It was then that Sheriff Morales decided to intervene. She entered the room, the sound of the door breaking the tense silence. She slapped a large map onto the table, right next to the photo of Rachel. A single red X was marked on it. "You marked this spot," she said, her voice firm, pointing to the X. "The exact location where Rachel's body was found. Why?" Keene glanced at it briefly, almost dismissively. That's a special place. A place people are drawn to. Why? Morales asked, her own unease turning into a cold dread. Because it's quiet, Keen replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Because it feels like an ending. A chill rippled through Morales. This man spoke of death as if it were a beautiful, peaceful destination. Did you bring her there? She asked, her voice barely audible. No, Keen said, shaking his head slowly. She chose it. It wasn't enough to hold him. Not even close. No DNA connecting him to the scene. No eyewitness who saw him with Rachel in those final moments. And certainly no confession. Keen walked out of the station a free man, pending further investigation. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. The local news channels had a field day. Headlines screamed from the front pages, "The Woods Killer walks free. Why won't police act?" Morales's inbox was flooded with emails around the clock. Some were from desperate people, pleading with her to get this monster off the streets. Some were threatening, accusing her of incompetence. And then there were the others, the ones that were almost more disturbing. Emails from people who seemed to believe Keen, who argued that Rachel had chosen her own fate, that second path had simply helped her find peace. The truth felt like it was slipping away, caught between two terrifying extremes. The pressure was immense, but without new evidence, their hands were tied. Morales and Holloway worked tirelessly, digging deeper into second path, trying to unravel the web of this so-called spiritual group. It was a digital ghost operating through encrypted apps and anonymous forums. It was like trying to catch smoke. Then their worst fears were realized. A second body was found, 5 miles east of the first location in another secluded part of the forest. Another woman. This one was younger, just in her early 20s. She was also placed carefully, almost ceremoniously, as if she was sleeping. There was no visible trauma, no sign of a struggle. She was just gone, alone in the woods. The pattern was no longer a theory. It was terrifyingly real. Her name was Hannah Lowe, a bright college student home for the summer. Her parents had reported her missing 3 days earlier, their voices frantic with worry. When the toxicology report came back, it was a mirror image of Rachel Whitman's, a powerful sedative in her system, cause of death, asphyxiation. And when the digital forensics team cracked open her laptop and phone, they found it. The link, the common denominator. Second path. Hannah hadn't been talking to Thomas Keen. She had a different guide, a different online mentor. But the language they used was identical. The same empty promises of transformation, of release, of finding a final peace. Sheriff Morales stood in the evidence room late that night, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The walls were covered with photos. Rachel's smiling face next to Hannah's hopeful one. Maps dotted with red pins. Screenshots of cryptic messages from Second Path. A hollow feeling was forming in her chest, a cold, empty space where frustration and grief churned together. This wasn't just one man. This was an organization, a twisted ideology spreading like a poison. King wasn't just a killer. He was a recruiter, a high priest of a death cult hiding in plain sight. They hadn't just let a killer walk free. They had let a plague back out into the world. And now it had claimed another victim. The question wasn't just how to stop Keen anymore. It was how to stop Second Path before another lost soul was drawn to the quiet of the woods, looking for an ending they didn't have to choose. This isn't one man, Holloway said quietly. It's a system. And systems don't leave fingerprints, Morales replied. They brought Keen back in. He listened calmly as they told him about Hannah. When they finished, he closed his eyes. That's tragic, he said. But it isn't my doing. You helped build the road that led her there, Morales snapped back. Keen opened his eyes. People walk their own paths, Sheriff. Not when someone is guiding them into the dark, Morales retorted. Keen studied her. Are you sure, he asked softly, that you're not just afraid of what happens when people stop fighting the pain? Morales ended the interview right there. She needed air. The task force expanded overnight. Federal agents, behavioral analysts, cybercrime specialists. They descended on the case, mapping the Second Path forum like a complex neural network. They were looking for nodes, patterns, similarities in language. What they discovered was chilling. Second Path wasn't encouraging suicide outright. That was the brilliance of it and the absolute horror. It skillfully reframed death as a form of rest. It painted surrender as a choice, isolation as a path to clarity. Legally, it existed in a murky gray area. Morally, it was a graveyard. At a major briefing, a profiler stood before a silent room. These guides, she explained, pointing to a screen filled with usernames, derive their control not through force, but through permission. They convince vulnerable people that dying is an act of agency, an ultimate expression of their own will. And then, Morales asked, her voice cutting through the quiet. They remove friction, the profiler replied. They arrange the meeting, provide the drug, secure the place. The person feels like they're being guided, not killed. A heavy silence filled the room. This is where so many investigations of this nature fail, the profiler continued. Because from the outside, it doesn't look like murder. It looks like consent. If you're still here, still listening, still following every twist and turn of this case, this is the moment where stories like this one separate from the simple headlines you might scroll past. This is where the uncomfortable truths live, the ones that don't fit into neat, tidy explanations. This case is about to get darker, more complicated, and far more personal for everyone involved. If you want to stay with us as we uncover what happens next, make sure you're subscribed. Because the next chapter is where everything changes. The turning point came from a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake made by the killer. It was made by the community they had built. For the first time in years, a member of Second Path posted publicly a farewell message. It was poetic, final, and a massive error. The cybercrime unit traced it in minutes. They found the woman alive, but just barely. She was in a motel room, sedated, confused, waiting for a guide who never arrived. Her name was Elise Parker, and she was ready to talk. They said it would be peaceful. Elise whispered from her hospital bed, her voice weak. That someone would stay with me. Who? Morales asked, leaning in. I don't know his real name, Elise said. But he told me he learned from the best. Who's the best? Holloway pressed gently. Elise's eyes filled with tears. North Star, she said. Morales felt the ground shift beneath her. North Star. It wasn't just another username. It was a title. They immediately went back to Keen's journals, reading them again, but this time much slower, dissecting every word. And there it was. A phrase repeated dozens of times, hidden in plain sight. I lit the first fire. Others will carry the flame. James Keen hadn't been the end of the line. He was just the beginning. When they arrested him again, this time on conspiracy charges, he didn't fight. He didn't even seem surprised. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked directly at Sheriff Morales. You can stop me, he said, his voice soft but firm. But you can't stop the idea. Morales didn't answer. She couldn't, because in that moment, she knew he was right. The woods where the first bodies were found were searched again, every circled location on Keen's maps meticulously re-examined. What they were about to find would change the case forever. And it would force Sheriff Linda Morales to confront a truth so devastating, she wasn't sure she could survive it. They started with the circles on the map, each one drawn with a shaky but deliberate hand. Each circle marked a place that felt the same when you stood inside it. An unnerving quiet that seemed to press against your eardrums, a physical weight. The trees grew too close together, their branches interlocking overhead, and the sunlight thinned out, struggling to pierce the canopy, as if the woods themselves were slowly swallowing the light. These weren't just random clearings or accidental gaps in the forest. You could feel it in your bones. Someone had walked these paths before, slowly, thoughtfully. They had chosen these specific spots. Search teams found out, moving in precise, methodical grids. The sound of their boots crunching through years of old, dry leaves was punctuated by the soft, intermittent hissing of their radios. They were prepared for the worst. They expected to find remains, shallow graves, something definite, something unmistakable that would end the gnawing uncertainty. But what they found instead were just traces, whispers of a presence. In one clearing, a patch of flattened earth, the perfect indentation of where someone had knelt for a long time. In another, a collection of cigarette butts, so old and weathered they were just pale, bleached filters. And perhaps the most jarring discovery, a single short strip of duct tape stuck high on a tree branch, its adhesive long dead, flapping uselessly in the slight breeze. These were all signs of presence, not of violence. There was no chaos here, no sign of a struggle. It felt less like a crime scene and more like a ritual. Morales stood at the edge of one of the clearings, watching a deputy meticulously photograph the ground. The air was heavy, still. "This isn't a dump site," the deputy said, his voice low, barely a whisper. "It's a meeting place." Morales nodded slowly, her gaze sweeping across the shadowed woods. "And meetings don't happen just once," she replied, a chill crawling up her spine that had nothing to do with the cool forest air. By the end of the week, the count stood at 4. 4 women, their cases spanning a period of 6 years. All of them found in similar wooded areas, all within a 50-mile radius. The toxicology reports from each case showed striking similarities. And most damningly, all 4 women had a connection, however tenuous, to the wellness group known as Second Path. Suddenly, the past began to rearrange itself, old files and closed cases snapping into a new, horrifying focus. 2 of the deaths had been ruled accidental overdoses at the time. A tragic but not uncommon story. One had been labeled a suicide, a note left behind, a case closed with a somber finality. But the 4th victim, Rachel, her recent disappearance and discovery, had forced this terrifying pattern into the harsh light of day. The coincidences were no longer coincidences. They were a trail. And the question that haunted Morales, that kept her awake at night, wasn't who was responsible. It was how many more were there? How many accidents and suicides were actually something else? Public opinion, which had been a storm of confusion and fear, shifted once again. The initial arrest of Keane, the charismatic leader of Second Path, for conspiracy to obstruct justice, satisfied absolutely no one. It felt like a half measure, a placating move. Some media outlets and online forums called it a witch hunt, an attack on an alternative spiritual movement. Meanwhile, Second Path itself began to splinter under the pressure. Some members vanished completely, deleting their social media, their digital footprints gone as if they never existed. But others, the more zealous ones, doubled down. They claimed they were being persecuted, that their spiritual journey was being misunderstood. They declared it a form of spiritual warfare against their enlightenment. One post in particular went viral. It was just a single sentence over a serene image of a forest. Asterisk, "They are afraid of us, because we are not afraid to let go." Asterisk. Morales read it at her desk long after midnight, the rest of the office dark and silent, the only light coming from the cold glow of her monitor. The words echoed in the quiet room. She thought of Rachel's sister Carol. In the beginning, Carol had called constantly, demanding answers, pushing for updates. But now, silence. She had stopped calling, stopped asking questions. Her grief had gone quiet. And that quiet, that resignation, frightened Morales more than Carol's anger ever could. The pressure from above was relentless. The district attorney wanted charges that would stick, a solid case with no loopholes. The governor's office wanted to offer public reassurance to calm the growing panic. And the media, as always, wanted a face. They wanted a monster they could plaster across the news. And finally, they got one. His name was Daniel Frost. He wasn't a guide in Second Path, not officially. His name didn't appear on any of their membership rolls. He was a local park volunteer. A man in his late 30s, recently divorced, no criminal record. He seemed normal, unremarkable, but his name had been logged on the volunteer duty roster for the park on the very night Rachel disappeared. His phone had pinged near 2 of the circled locations on Morales' map on separate occasions. And then came the piece they were waiting for. His DNA, though partial and degraded by the elements, was a potential match for the sample found on that weathered strip of duct tape. It wasn't conclusive. It wasn't a smoking gun. But in a case this high profile, with this much pressure, it was enough. The arrest happened fast. Too fast. Morales watched from her car as Frost was led into the courthouse, his face pale and slack with shock, his eyes wide with a frantic disbelief. Reporters swarmed him, shoving microphones and cameras in his face, their questions a chaotic roar. "I didn't do anything," he yelled, his voice cracking with panic as the flashes illuminated his terrified face. I help people out there. I'm a volunteer. Morales felt something heavy and cold twist in her gut. Holloway, her partner, sat in the passenger seat, his expression grim as he watched the scene unfold. He turned to her, his voice quiet. Does this feel right to you? Morales didn't take her eyes off Frost being shoved through the courthouse doors. No, she said, her own voice barely a whisper. It feels easy, and in her experience, easy cases were the most dangerous kind of all. They were the ones where the real truth often stayed hidden, buried just beneath the surface, waiting. Frost's interrogation was a complete mess. He cried, he rambled, and he kept contradicting himself. But this wasn't the kind of contradiction you see in a practiced liar. This was the raw, jumbled terror of someone who's had their world pulled out from under them, someone for whom language itself has failed. Yes, I met women on the trails, he admitted, his voice cracking. People talk to me. I'm a good listener. That's all it is. Did you know Rachel Whitman? Detective Holloway asked, his voice sharp and direct. No, Frost insisted, shaking his head frantically. I swear I didn't. Then my partner Morales chimed in, holding up her tablet. But you're on the forum. Second path. Frost just stared at her, his eyes wide with confusion. I read it. He finally managed to say, I never posted anything. I just thought it was, I don't know. People who needed help. Did you ever use it to arrange meetings? Morales pressed, her gaze unwavering. No, he said, the word barely a whisper. Never. And the tape? Holloway pushed, referring to the roll of electrical tape found near the crime scene, a brand matching what Frost used. What about the tape? I use that for trail markers, Frost explained, his voice pleading. I always have. It helps people find their way. Morales wasn't looking at his face anymore. She was watching his hands. They were trembling uncontrollably. This wasn't a man in control, carefully crafting a lie. This was a man consumed by pure, unadulterated fear. But the DA's office didn't see it that way. They were under immense pressure to close the case, and they needed a suspect. Daniel Frost, the quiet park ranger who kept to himself, fit the profile just well enough. Meanwhile, locked away in his cell, the original prime suspect Keene watched the news coverage of Frost's arrest. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. He knew he was off the hook. The trial began under a heavy, suffocating cloud of public opinion. The courthouse was surrounded by protesters. On one side, people held signs demanding justice for Rachel. On the other, signs that read, "Stop criminalizing grief," defending Frost's role as a supposed helper on the trails. Inside, the atmosphere was just as tense. The prosecution went to work, painting Frost as a cunning manipulator. A wolf in sheep's clothing, hiding his sinister intentions behind a mask of good deeds. They hammered home the DNA evidence found at the scene, his proximity to the area, and the ample opportunity he had. They presented him as the shadow lurking just off the path. The defense, however, punched back hard. They poked holes in the prosecution's narrative, highlighting the inconsistencies, the lack of a direct motive, the mountain of reasonable doubt. They argued that the context was everything. The Second Path Forum, this strange online community, loomed over the entire proceeding like a thick, disorienting fog. No one could quite grasp what it was or who was really pulling the strings. Morales sat in the back of the courtroom, a knot tightening in her stomach. Every single one of her instincts was screaming that they were drifting far off course, that the real truth was slipping through their fingers while they focused on the wrong man. She could feel it in her bones. This was a mistake. And then it happened. The testimony that shattered the entire case. A woman named Elise Parker took the stand. She had been another user on the Second Path Forum, someone who had been drawn in by its promises of guidance and peace. She began to describe the voice that had guided her, the person who had pulled her into the group's orbit. She talked about their specific language, the particular way they phrased their promises, the unique cadence of their words online. And then she said the name. The real name of the person who had been her guide. It wasn't Frost. It wasn't Keene. It was a name that had never once appeared anywhere in their entire investigation. A name that had been invisible to them until this very moment. Morales felt the blood drain from her face. The courtroom fell silent. A shockwave rippled through the gallery. The judge, sensing the seismic shift, adjourned the court early for the day. In the hallway, Holloway cornered Morales, his face pale and his eyes wide. "That name," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "It's not on any of our lists. It's not in any of our files. But it's real," Morales replied, her voice firm despite the tremor she felt inside. "And we missed it." That evening, they went back to the evidence room. Their entire perspective shifted. They looked at everything again, but this time with fresh eyes. They weren't looking for Frost anymore. They were looking for someone else entirely. They re-examined the chat logs, the forum posts, the digital breadcrumbs. They started noticing different language patterns, different turns of phrase they had previously overlooked. It became clear that Second Path hadn't just evolved over time. It had migrated. The control had been passed from one person to another. 2 days later, they found it. A dormant user account. Quiet. Hidden in plain sight. An account that had been watching the whole time, observing their investigation from the digital shadows. The username was simple, deceptively simple. It was just Lark, and Lark was still active. The arrest warrant came down like a thunderclap. But by the time the tactical team kicked in the door, it was too late. Lark was already gone. The address tied to the account led to a small, empty apartment. The only things left were a few pieces of nondescript furniture and a lingering sense of absence. The neighbors didn't have much to offer. They described a woman, middle-aged, polite, utterly unremarkable. "She kept to herself," one of them said, "never caused any trouble. I used to see her walking in the evenings, always heading toward the woods." Morales stood at the window of the empty apartment, staring out at the dark tree line bordering the property. Of course she did, she thought. The woods were her sanctuary, her hunting ground. Daniel Frost was released from jail pending a full review of his case. He walked out into the daylight, a different man, thinner, quieter, his eyes permanently lowered to the ground as if the weight of the sky was too much to bear. Morales watched him go, the crushing weight of what they had almost done pressing down on her chest. They had almost broken an innocent man, destroyed his life. And the real predator, the one who orchestrated all of it, was still out there, guiding, waiting, watching. That night, Morales sat alone in her apartment, the city lights a distant blur. Her phone buzzed. An email. There was no sender name, no subject line. Just a single, chilling sentence. "You're getting warmer." Attached to the email was a photo. A wooded clearing, bathed in the eerie light of dusk. The ground was freshly disturbed, but unmarked. It was a new place, a new beginning. Morales felt her own pulse pounding in her ears. This wasn't just about control anymore. This wasn't about a game of cat and mouse. This was about recognition. Lark was acknowledging her, taunting her. And in that moment, Morales knew that someone, this ghost in the machine, had decided she was finally ready to see the real truth. The hunt had just become personal. Thanks for watching. If you're intrigued by this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the shadows. We'll see you next time. Sheriff Linda Morales didn't show the email to anyone. Not at first. She sat alone in her office long after midnight with the lights turned off. The only illumination came from her laptop, casting a pale blue glow across the walls. On the screen was a photograph. It showed a dense forest, trees pressed so tightly together that the moonlight could barely pierce the canopy. The ground looked disturbed, as if someone had been standing there recently, waiting. The photo's metadata confirmed what her gut was already screaming at her. It had been taken less than 12 hours earlier, from deep inside Black Hollow Forest. The killer, known only as Lark, wasn't hiding. She was sending an invitation. By morning, the entire task force knew. The room erupted. There was yelling, threats of a federal takeover, and heated arguments about protocol and personal risk. An FBI supervisor, his face tight with frustration, pointed a finger at her. "You cannot engage directly," he warned. "This is exactly what they want." Morales stood firm, her arms folded, her jaw set like stone. "She already engaged," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "The moment she killed Rachel." "She wants attention," the supervisor shot back. "No," Morales replied, her voice dropping to a quiet, chilling tone that silenced the room. "She wants understanding." With that, the focus of the investigation shifted. They stopped looking at the victims as just pieces of evidence and started seeing them as people again. Rachel, Anna, all the others. They dug deeper, searching for a connection that went beyond simple grief or isolation. And they found it. Guilt. Rachel's emails, unearthed from a forgotten server, revealed a secret she had carried for years, a mistake at work that had cost her company millions. It had been covered up, quietly settled. No charges were ever filed, but the weight of it had never left her. Hannah's story was similar. Years ago, she was involved in a drunk driving accident. Someone was hurt. But the charges were reduced, her record sealed. It was a pattern. The earlier victims all had similar skeletons in their closets. They had all been given second chances that to them never felt earned. Lark wasn't just offering an end to their pain. She was offering absolution. The breakthrough that identified the killer came by accident. A linguistic analyst sifting through mountains of data noticed a peculiar phrase. It appeared again and again in the private communications of the victims across accounts spanning nearly a decade. The phrase was, "You've already paid." It existed nowhere else online. Only in the encrypted communications on the Second Path network. And in a self-published book of essays written 12 years earlier by a woman named Margaret Lyle. Margaret Lyle was a former hospice counselor and grief therapist. Her career had ended abruptly after an ethics investigation involving improper patient boundaries. She had vanished shortly after. Morales stared at Lyle's old professional photo. She had kind eyes, a soft, reassuring smile. She looked like someone you would trust with your last words. Then came the final, gut-wrenching piece of the puzzle. Margaret Lyle had lost a daughter, killed by a drunk driver who served only 18 months in prison. The connection snapped into place with a force that stole Morales's breath. This wasn't random violence. This was a twisted philosophy put into practice. They tracked Lyle to a remote cabin just outside the county lines. It was completely off-grid, nestled deep in the woods. The tactical teams moved in with silent, practiced precision, weapons raised, every sense on high alert. They found the cabin empty, but it was warm. A kettle was still steaming on the stove, and on the table a notebook lay open. Inside, a single line was written in neat, deliberate script. "They don't need punishment. They need peace." Morales felt unexpected tears sting her eyes. She hated herself for it, but somewhere deep inside, a traitorous part of her understood the seductive power of that idea. The final message from Lark, from Margaret Lyle, arrived 2 nights later. It was another photo of another clearing in the woods. But this time it came with something more. A set of coordinates and a time. The debate in the command center raged for hours. It had to be a trap, an ambush, a setup for a bloody standoff, but Morales made the call. "She wants me there," she stated, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I'm going." Her deputy Holloway was on his feet instantly. "No," he said, his voice firm. "She's already chosen the place," Morales replied, her gaze unwavering. "All I'm choosing is whether someone dies tonight." Holloway stared at her for a long, heavy moment. Then with a slow, reluctant nod, he stepped aside. The woods were alive that night. The wind moved through the branches like breath through lungs. The forest floor was soft and uneven under Morales's boots as she followed the path alone. Her radio was muted, her weapon holstered but ready. She reached the clearing at the exact time specified. Margaret Lyle stood at the center, her hands folded calmly in front of her. She was unarmed. There was no fear in her eyes, only a strange sort of peace. "I was hoping it would be you," Lyle said, her voice soft. "Why?" Morales asked, her own voice tight. "Because you still believe in lines," Lyle replied with a small, knowing smile. "Right and wrong, guilt and innocence. I wanted to see how heavy they feel when you're holding them all alone." "You killed them," Morales said, the words feeling blunt and inadequate. "I helped them stop suffering," Lyle corrected gently, as if explaining something to a child. "You decided that for them." "They asked me to," Lyle said. "The same way people asked me to sit with them while they died, holding a hand, offering comfort. Is that so different?" Morales felt her voice begin to shake, a tremor of rage and confusion running through her. "You don't get to choose who deserves peace," Lyle's sad smile returned. Neither does the system, she said. And in the suffocating silence of the forest, Morales had no answer. Thank you for watching. If this story captured your imagination, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you do not miss our next dive into the shadows. We'll see you in the next one. Backup moved in silently around the clearing. Lyle seemed unsurprised when the lights came on. As she was cuffed, she leaned close to Morales. You'll carry this too, she whispered. Knowing how easy it would be to let people rest, Morales watched her disappear into the dark, a hollow opening in her chest that no arrest could close. Margaret Lyle was convicted. Conspiracy, manslaughter, criminal facilitation of suicide. No murder charge. Her sentence was long but finite. Second path dissolved, but fragments lingered, accounts resurfaced. Language echoed. Ideas were harder to cage than people. Months later, Morales walked the trail alone. The woods were quieter now. Or maybe she was. She stopped at the clearing where Rachel had been found. Nothing marked it. No sign, no stone, just trees. Morales stood there for a long time, thinking of all the women who had come here believing they were choosing an ending, never knowing how carefully that choice had been shaped. If you've stayed with this story to this point through every turn, every doubt, every uncomfortable truth, then you understand why these stories matter. They aren't just about monsters in the dark. They're about the quiet spaces where influence becomes power. If you want to keep exploring cases like this, where the answers are never simple and the truth leaves scars, make sure you're subscribed. Because the woods don't stop whispering, and neither do the stories buried inside them. Years later, a new missing persons report crossed Morales' desk. A woman, a park. A message that read, I think I'm ready to rest. Morales closed the file slowly. Outside, the trees stood waiting. If you or someone you know is going through a tough time, remember that help is available. You can reach out to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline or the Crisis Text Line. Your story matters, and you don't have to go through it alone. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into complex cases. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. See you next time.